A Supreme Court decision just dropped that could change how federal gun charges work across America. And if you're carrying a firearm, this ruling affects every single situation where you might face federal prosecution. This was a 9-0 unanimous decision. And what makes it so important is that it's about protecting gun owners from being punished twice for the same act. Before we dive into the details, quick question. Are you subscribed yet? No? Then you're missing out on critical legal updates that could keep you out of serious trouble. Here's the thing. 90% of gun owners don't hear about Supreme Court decisions until it's too late. Don't be part of that group. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss an update that could literally save your freedom. All right, let's talk about what just happened. On January 14th, 2026, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in a case called Barrett versus United States. This wasn't a 5-4 split decision. This wasn't liberals versus conservatives. This was 9-0. Every single justice agreed. And when that happens, you know something major just changed. Here's what you need to understand. This case involves two different federal gun laws that are part of the same section of federal code, section 924. The first law is called 924C. This law says if you use, carry, or possess a firearm during a federal crime of violence or a drug trafficking crime, you face a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. And here's the kicker. That sentence must run on top of whatever sentence you get for the underlying crime. So if you rob someone and you have a gun, you get punished for the robbery, and then you get an additional 5 years minimum for having the gun. Now, the second law is called 924J. This law was added in 1994 specifically for situations where someone violates 924C, and that violation causes someone's death. This law is serious. It authorizes the death penalty if the killing is murder. If it's manslaughter, you can face up to 15 years depending on whether it's voluntary or involuntary manslaughter. Here's where the problem came in. Federal prosecutors were charging people with both crimes at the same time for the exact same act. Think about that. You commit one action, they charge you twice, convict you twice, and punish you twice. That's where the double jeopardy issue comes in. Let me give you the story of the guy at the center of this case. His name is Dwayne Barrett. Between August 2011 and January 2012, Barrett was involved in a series of robberies. During one of those robberies, someone was shot and killed. The federal government charged Barrett with 7 different counts. 3 of those counts are what matter for our discussion today. Count 5 charged him with robbery under the Hobbs Act. That's a federal law against robbery. Count 6 charged him with using a firearm during that robbery, which violates section 924C. And count 7 charged him with causing a death during that firearm violation, which is section 924J. A jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 90 years in prison. But here's where it gets interesting. Barrett's case went through multiple appeals. After some other Supreme Court decisions changed how certain laws work, his sentence got reduced to 50 years. But the big question remained. Could he be convicted of both count 6 under 924C and count 7 under 924J for the exact same act? The Second Circuit Court of Appeals said yes. They ruled that prosecutors could stack both convictions. But Barrett appealed to the Supreme Court, and this is where everything changed. The Supreme Court looked at something called the Blockburger test. This is a nearly 100-year-old rule that says Congress doesn't normally intend to punish someone twice for the same offense. The test asks a simple question. Does each crime require proof of a fact that the other doesn't? If the answer is no, then they're basically the same offense, and you can't be convicted of both. Here's the critical part. Everyone agreed that Section 924C and Section 924J fail the Blockburger test. That means they define the same offense. Section 924J requires you to prove everything in Section 924C plus the fact that someone died. That makes 924J what lawyers call a lesser included offense. It's like saying you can't be convicted of both assault and aggravated assault for punching someone once. Now, quick legal note, this is educational information, not legal advice. If you're facing federal charges or any criminal charges involving firearms, you need to consult an attorney for your specific situation. Every case is different, and what I'm explaining here is general legal principles, not advice for your personal circumstances. So the Supreme Court had to decide if Congress clearly intended to break from this normal rule and allow 2 convictions for the same act. And here's what they found. Congress knows about the Blockburger rule. When Congress wants to override it, Congress uses very specific language. They'll say something like, a conviction shall be in addition to punishment for another offense. And guess what? Congress used that exact language twice in Section 924 itself. They said that a 924C conviction must be in addition to punishment for the underlying crime, like robbery. They also used it for another subsection about armor-piercing ammunition. So Congress clearly knew how to authorize multiple convictions when they wanted to. But when you look at the relationship between 924C and 924J, that language isn't there. Congress never said that 924J convictions should be in addition to 924C convictions. That silence is huge. The government tried to argue that another part of the law showed Congress wanted both convictions. They pointed to language that says a 924C sentence must run consecutively to any other term of imprisonment. They said this means it should run consecutively to a 924J sentence too. But here's where the Supreme Court shut that down. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote the opinion, and she explained that the consecutive sentence rule only matters after you've already decided whether two convictions are allowed in the first place. You can't use a rule about how to arrange sentences to prove that two convictions should exist. It's putting the cart before the horse. Think of it this way. The question is, can you have two convictions? The consecutive sentence rule says, if you have two convictions, they must run back to back. But that doesn't answer whether you should have two convictions to begin with. Congress answered the first question when it comes to the underlying crime. It said, yes, you can have both a 924C conviction and a robbery conviction. But Congress never said yes when it comes to having both a 924C conviction and a 924J conviction. If you're finding this helpful, imagine what you'll learn in my next video where I break down the exact rights you have when police ask if you're carrying. I will cover the 5 words that can protect you from saying something that gets used against you in court. Subscribe so you don't miss it, because knowing your rights could be the difference between walking away free and spending years behind bars. Let me break down what this means in practical terms. If federal prosecutors charge someone with causing death during a federal crime of violence while using a gun, they now have to make a choice. They can charge under Section 924C, which has mandatory minimum sentences starting at 5 years and going up depending on how the gun was used. Or they can charge under Section 924J, which allows for much higher maximum sentences, including the death penalty for murder, but has no mandatory minimums. What they can't do anymore is charge both and stack the convictions. That was the key point. The Supreme Court said this ruling prevents prosecutors from piling on convictions for what is essentially the same conduct. Now here's something important that came out of this case. The court mentioned a previous case called Laura versus United States from 2023. In that case, the court ruled that the mandatory consecutive sentence requirement in 924C does not apply to 924J sentences. So 924J operates independently with its own sentencing rules. When you combine Laura with this new Barrett decision, here's what you get. Section 924J is designed as an alternative to Section 924C for the most serious cases where death occurs. It's not meant to be stacked on top. Congress created it to give prosecutors flexibility. They can go for the death penalty or life in prison in murder cases, but they don't have the safety net of mandatory minimums that 924C provides. This creates an interesting strategic situation for prosecutors. If they're not seeking the death penalty, Section 924C has major advantages. It has mandatory minimums that guarantee serious prison time. Those minimums stack on top of whatever the underlying crime carries. And most importantly, after this ruling, it clearly preserves the conviction for the underlying crime of violence. Here's why that last point matters. In recent years, lots of 924C and 924J convictions have been thrown out because courts have narrowed what counts as a crime of violence under these laws. When that happens, if the person still has their underlying crime conviction, like robbery, they get resentenced on that. But under the Supreme Court's reasoning in Barrett, if someone is convicted under 924J, the double jeopardy clause might prevent them from also having a conviction for the underlying crime of violence. That means if the 924J conviction gets thrown out years later, because the legal definition changed, there might not be any conviction left at all. That's a big risk for prosecutors, which gives them even more reason to stick with 924C in most cases. Hey, 73% of people watching right now aren't subscribed. Don't be part of that group. Join the community of gun owners who get these critical legal updates first. When a Supreme Court decision drops that affects your Second Amendment rights, or how federal gun laws work, you want to know about it immediately, not months later. Click that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let me give you a hypothetical example to make this concrete. Here's a hypothetical situation to explain this. Imagine someone is involved in a federal drug trafficking conspiracy. During one transaction, they have a gun and someone ends up getting killed. Under the old approach that some courts were using, prosecutors could charge count 1 for drug trafficking, count 2 for having a gun during drug trafficking under 924C, and count 3 for causing death during that gun possession under 924J. Under that scenario, the person would face 3 separate convictions and 3 separate sentences. The drug trafficking sentence, then a mandatory minimum of at least 5 years. For the gun under 924C that must run consecutively, and then additional time under 924J that could include life in prison or even the death penalty. But after this Supreme Court ruling, that's not allowed anymore. Prosecutors have to choose. They can charge the drug trafficking in 924C, Or they can charge the drug trafficking in 924J, but they can't charge all three and stack both gun convictions on top of each other. This matters because it limits how much federal prosecutors can pile on charges for the same conduct. The principle here is fundamental to our justice system. You can't be punished multiple times for the same criminal act. That's what the double jeopardy clause in the Fifth Amendment is all about. Now, some people might wonder, doesn't this let dangerous criminals off easier? That's actually the argument that the court-appointed attorney made when defending the lower court's decision. He said that if you don't allow both convictions, people who commit the most serious offenses, ones resulting in death, could escape the mandatory minimums of 924C. But the Supreme Court rejected that concern. Justice Jackson explained that Section 924J was designed with sentencing flexibility in mind. Yes, it doesn't have mandatory minimums, but it authorizes incredibly harsh maximum sentences. Death penalty for murder, up to 15 years for voluntary manslaughter. These punishments reflect how serious these crimes are, just using a different approach than rigid mandatory minimums. Plus, federal judges are required by law to consider the seriousness of the offense when sentencing. They have to impose sentences that reflect how serious the crime is and avoid creating unfair disparities between similar defendants. So judges sentencing under 924J will absolutely take into account that someone died. The idea that they would impose light sentences just because there's no mandatory minimum doesn't match reality. And if prosecutors are really worried that a judge might sentence too low under 924J in a particular case, they have an option. They can charge under 924C instead, which guarantees those mandatory minimums. That choice is now in their hands. This information could literally change how your case is handled if you ever face federal charges. Subscribe now because my next video explains the 3 biggest mistakes gun owners make when dealing with federal agents and how to avoid each one. You don't want to miss that. The Supreme Court also addressed the structure of the law. The attorney defending the lower court's decision pointed out that Section 924C and Section 924J are physically separated in the federal code. He argued that this separation, plus the fact that 924J has its own completely independent sentencing scheme, shows that Congress intended them to be separate stackable offenses. But the court wasn't convinced. They said that when 2 offenses share the same elements but have different penalty schemes, that suggests Congress intended to give prosecutors a menu to choose from, not a buffet where they can take everything. The different sentencing schemes are alternatives, not additions. There was one previous case that the defending attorney tried to use called Barrett versus United States. In that case, the Supreme Court found that the Blockburger presumption was overcome even without express statutory language. But the court in Barrett said Barrett was different. Barrett involved a continuing criminal enterprise that lasted more than 5 years. The continuing nature of that offense played a big role in the decision. Barrett, on the other hand, involves the classic situation of a lesser included offense and a greater offense where the exact same conduct violates both statutes. That's exactly the situation where the Blockburger presumption is supposed to apply most strongly. So what's the bottom line here? This ruling protects people from being convicted twice for the same act when it comes to these 2 federal gun laws. It reaffirms that the double jeopardy principles in our Constitution mean something. And it clarifies that unless Congress clearly says otherwise, you can't face multiple convictions for what amounts to the same offense. This is especially important for anyone who carries a firearm, whether for self-defense, for work, or any other lawful purpose. If you ever find yourself in a situation that escalates and results in federal charges, this ruling could be the difference between facing 1 conviction or 2 stacked convictions for the same conduct. The fact that this decision was 9-0 tells you something. This wasn't a controversial legal interpretation. This wasn't judges pushing a political agenda. This was the court applying long-standing principles of criminal law that protect all Americans from being punished multiple times for the same act. Here's something else to keep in mind. This ruling came down on January 14th, 2026. Cases that are currently pending in federal courts around the country where prosecutors charged both 924C and 924J for the same conduct will now be affected. Defense attorneys will be citing this case to get one of those convictions thrown out. And for people who have already been convicted and sentenced under both provisions, this could be grounds for appeal or for challenging their sentences. If you or someone you know is in that situation, this is exactly the kind of Supreme Court precedent that a good criminal defense attorney will use. Let me wrap this up with the key takeaways you need to remember. First, the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that you cannot be convicted of both Section 924C and Section 924J for a single act. Second, this ruling is based on the principle that Congress does not intend to punish the same offense twice, unless it clearly says so. Third, Congress knows how to authorize multiple convictions when it wants to, and it didn't do that here. Fourth, this ruling gives prosecutors a choice, but it prevents them from stacking charges. And fifth, This decision protects the fundamental constitutional principle against double jeopardy. This ruling matters for every gun owner in America because it limits how federal prosecutors can pile on firearms charges. It restores balance to a system where the government had been, in some courts, getting away with punishing people twice for the same conduct. Look, I spent hours researching Supreme Court decisions, reading legal opinions, and breaking down complex legal concepts so you don't have to. The least you can do is hit that subscribe button to support this channel. When you subscribe, you're not just getting legal updates. You're joining a community of informed, responsible gun owners who understand their rights and stay ahead of legal changes. So do yourself a favor and subscribe right now. This decision is massive, and most gun owners have no idea it even happened. That's exactly why this channel exists. To cut through the noise, explain what these legal decisions actually mean, and help you understand how they affect your rights and your freedom. Remember, this is educational information designed to help you understand the law. It's not legal advice for your specific situation. If you're facing criminal charges, especially federal charges involving firearms, you need to speak with a qualified criminal defense attorney who can analyze your specific facts and circumstances. Laws change. Court decisions happen all the time. And if you're not staying informed, you're leaving yourself vulnerable. Subscribe to this channel so you're always in the know when the next major legal development drops. Because I guarantee you, this won't be the last major Supreme Court decision affecting gun owners. When the next one comes, you'll want to hear about it here first. Thanks for watching. Stay informed, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.